And they wonder, like, what is the difference between poverty and what's the difference between living poor? Poverty is really about a person lacking enough resources or money to provide for the necessities of life. Hi, this is Anita from the Dusty Roads podcast. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about poverty, and specifically, is poverty and living poor exactly the same thing? First, I define what poverty is. Poverty refers to lacking enough resources to provide for the necessities of life: food, clean water, shelter, and clothing. Poverty is best defined as someone who cannot provide for life necessities. So, that's why homelessness is an indication of poverty. But living poor is essentially not the same as poverty. In other words, a person could live in a third world country, which means they live poor, but they may not fit the definition of poverty, or what is known as worldwide poverty. In other words, even though they live in an emerging country, they may have housing, clean water, food, and clothing. Yes, they may not live in the most luxurious place, and they may or may not have electricity, or they may not have an air conditioner. Their water, they may need to boil to ensure it's clean. They may grow their food by themselves and produce their clothing. So technically, they would not be considered in poverty, but they could be considered living in poor or living in poor conditions. I've spent a lot of time up in the mountain areas of North Vietnam, where some ethnic hill tribe minorities live. And many of these ethnic minority hill tribe people might be considered living poor, but not in poverty. Most of them have handmade wooden or bamboo houses. They may need to boil the water, grow their own food, and they may make their own clothes. Most people would consider the hill tribe people as being poor or living poor, but technically speaking, they are not living in poverty. They can still take care of their basic human necessities. So on the other hand, there could be a homeless person living in San Francisco working two jobs, and earning money would be considered, good income in most parts of the world, but they could still be considered as poor or living in poverty because they are homeless. But, the city of San Francisco is so expensive, they cannot afford a place to live. As they cannot afford housing, they would be considered living in poverty. So this really is kind of the difference, where if you take the same person that was living in San Francisco, may also have a mobile phone and an iPad or laptop, which the hill tribe person may not have. So that hill tribe person who is here in Vietnam, who may live in a wooden house, they might grow their own food, they may make their own clothes, would be considered someone who's living poor, but would not be living in poverty. Whereas someone in San Francisco could be homeless, and even though they may be working and earning a decent income, but because of the fact that they were homeless, they could be considered as living in poverty. That's where, between these two, it's a very fine line. Poverty is one of the issues that many people talk about and they wonder about, and they think about, but when they wonder, like, what is the difference between poverty and what's the difference between living poor? Poverty is really about a person lacking enough resources or money to provide for the necessities of life. And that really becomes the key here. A person can have all these necessities, but they may not have other things such as electricity. So, electricity, or, whether someone has a TV, or whether someone can afford, a car or a motorbike or whatever it is not one of the standards of living poor or poverty. In fact, it is very, very specific. It's about food, clean water, shelter, and clothing. Those three basic things. And if a person is lacking one of them, they are considered to be in poverty. You might ask yourself, well, why should I care about this? Why does this matter? This doesn't really matter to me. This doesn't really affect my life today. But, on a bus on a dusty road, which is the podcast for our blog, On a Bus on a Dusty Road, we believe that we should all live our life as a global citizen. It doesn't matter if you live in the United States, you live in England, Canada, Africa, Asia, or Polynesia. What matters is we all should be looking at ways to live our life as a global citizen. And part of living a life as a global citizen, I believe, is to understand some of the global issues, some of the issues of poverty and of living poor. One of the things that really struck me about this definition of poverty as I was reading it is there's nothing that says a person is in poverty if they cannot afford a phone. an iPad or laptop. So often we think that poverty means that you can't afford these new electronic devices, that you need to be able to afford these things. If you don't afford these things, then it means that you're in poverty. But poverty has nothing to do with a person's ability to communicate with the rest of the world or to have technical devices. Yes, being on the internet or having access to it can help someone get out of living poor, but it is not the criteria for poverty. And one of the great things about many of these electronic devices that I see that's happening in the world is it is becoming an equalizer in many parts of the world. Because now, especially if somebody is poor and they live in a country where, say, English is their native language. Here's also another interesting point to all of this. The truth is that a lot of these smart technical devices are helping people to be able to equal the playing field. In other words, if you are, say, a young mother in a developing country, you can read some English because English is your native language. You have your little smartphone. Your baby gets ill. You could get onto the internet and probably read something about what you need to do or how you can help that child, and that child may survive. There's a lot of great equalizers. I hear of companies now, I know of several groups that are working in Africa. And one of their goals in Africa is they're helping to bring technology into Africa. So people in Africa can stay in Africa and use technology to remote work and to earn a decent income. I believe as the world begins to grow more and as things like AI and all of these things come more into play in our lives, that this is going to become more of an equalizer. That it's going to help to be able to drive many people out of poverty because they're going to have access to things that they normally did not have before. And that really is the beauty in all of this, that our goal as a world and as a community and as global citizens should be, is how do we help the world or help people cut out of poverty? How do we help rise up these people so they can live a better and more fulfilled life? The good news is, on the health front, there are many things that are happening. There are organizations making very simple steps, taking very simple things by making sure that poor people get things such as a simple mosquito net so they don't get malaria, so that the children are able to be better protected. They are trying to educate the women since they have discovered that if a mother can read or write, then there is a very high likelihood that her children will live past the age of 5. And if a girl is educated, then she will not get married at a young age. And instead, she will not get married at a young age, but instead, she will then get married maybe after the age of 18, and she will be able to make decisions for herself for the rest of her life. So that's why these things matter. It matters because it matters to the world, it matters to the development of the world, and it should matter to each and every one of us. This is Anita from the Dusty Roads Podcast. We hope that you will join with us to live your life as a global citizen. We thank you for being part of our community. We hope you'll subscribe. We'd love to hear from you if you have any questions or comments. And thank you so much for being part of our community. Thank you to Rico also for making this podcast possible.